Thank you all for coming. And thank you to the technical department, you're heroes. And also, I want to start off by saying, this is for those who have been taken from us and for us who are surviving. We offered Maurice dates, grasshoppers, and water. Now, Maurice, Saint Maurice. Maurice from Meroe, Maurice from Alexandria, Maurice who died in the Swiss Alps, and then that village where he died was named after him, Saint Maurice. Yesterday, September 22nd, was Saint Maurice's Day, which I think is apt, and also an introduction into what we'll be doing today. Like, how do we remember those of the past? How do we attempt to repair their loss to us? I gotta start, of course, I mean, we're in the Netherlands, and Zwarte Piet is a thing. And Maurice was connected to Zwarte Piet in 2013. And I'll show you how. So this is a portrait that's hanging in the Rijksmuseum. And in 2013, the director of the Rijksmuseum at the time, Wim Pijbus, said that this is the first Black Piet painted ever. Okay, and this is 2013, so you gotta remember 2013 was the 150th year commemoration of the abolition of slavery in 1863. I should actually say 1873, but according to our archives and political history, it's 1863. That enslaved still had to work 10 more years to actually gain their freedom isn't mentioned there, and last summer we also had a little bit of an incident because our mayor was wearing a button which said 1873 during the Black Lives Matter demonstration on the 1st of June. And people were angry. Some people were angry, I should say. Some people who still want to refuse to acknowledge that the enslaved still had to work 10 years to gain their freedom, right? That we talk sincerely and honestly about that past, about our present. Now, Wim Pijbus is an interesting figure in this sense. He's residing over the opening of the new Rijksmuseum, right? He's residing over the renovation of that building, the renovation of the collection, the new ways in which they're installing it. And then in 2013, the year in which we should be thinking about enslavement, what that does, how our society is still built on that, he comes and presents Saint Maurice as Black Piet. Like, what is wrong with him, right? At least that's what I'm thinking. Now, he was quickly corrected. Esther Schreuder and Elmer Colvin, two researchers who have been doing art historical research on these types of paintings in which Black figures are present, but in which art historians never really bothered to find out who they were or what their function was within those paintings. They identified it immediately and said, like, no, Pijbus, this is your collection and you should know, but this is actually a painting of Saint Maurice. One of the earliest paintings in Western European art canon in which a Black man is depicted. Now, on the website of the Rijksmuseum, you can find more information on him. And this was done in the Netherlands, right? And I think this is also really interesting to think about. So this is about a century before Europeans would start to trade in human beings from Africa, right? So in a way, in the sense that the arguments were being presented in the 1600s for the enslavement of Africans, they were denying the presence of Africans within their midst from centuries before. So there's something happening there, where memory is then misused, memory is then let go, in which forgetting becomes the norm, and in which forgetting becomes something that reproduces this constant forgetting of the humanity of others. And so in 2013, when Wim said this, I was thinking to myself, okay, so, like, okay, we're talking about the abolition of slavery, we're talking about structures of inequality, and then art history is then used to deny the fight against these systems. Right? So how can we take that back? How can we play with that? In the summer of 2019, I was invited by Margaret Talley and Eva Ostakova. And Eva Ostakova is connected to the Latvian Center for Contemporary Art in Riga, in Latvia. And they have a project called Communicating Difficult Pasts, in which they're talking about difficult knowledges, difficult histories. Histories that don't connect to canons, histories that trouble our understanding of ourselves, knowledges which push against hegemonic understandings of domination. Right? And so they invited me to come over. I couldn't. I was in St. Martin and Curacao with my mom, working on some projects. And they were like, okay, then we'll ask you for November. So in November, around November 11th, 12th, I was in Riga, and I went to the Latvian National Museum of Art. And they also have like a lot of historical paintings. And as I was walking around there, I came across a cabinet display with a silver plate on it, with a lot of African heads on it. And I'm like, okay, a silver plate with African heads, like what does this mean? I know what it means in the context of the Netherlands. I mean, you have the Geelvink Museum here in Amsterdam, from the family Geelvink, in which their family crest has African heads on it. You have families up north in Groningen, Friesland, which also have family crests with African heads on it. You go to the Zeeuws Museum in Middelburg, there's an exhibition, I think on the 3rd floor, and you'll find a cabinet with family crests with African heads on it. Now, within the context of the Netherlands, that means that these were slave traders. These were people who were buying and selling Africans. These were people who created their wealth through the subjugation, dehumanization of others. These were people who bought into plantations, people who bought into suffering and worse. But they're being venerated in our museums, they're still on family crests, they're still seen as important, as, you know, powerful. So, I'm in this museum in Riga, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, I know that there was an Hanseatic League in which they were also connected and trading with, in which timber and wine and grain was being traveled back and forth, transported throughout Europe. But why is this here? What does this mean? Now, that particular silver plate had been saved by a museum worker during the Second World War from the Nazis, and they traveled throughout Europe to stay out of the hands of the Nazis. And so when I was there was a display on this woman and what she did, and which pieces she saved. Bits and pieces of stories, and some more elaborate than others. This one said that the silver plate came from the Blackheads house in Riga. And I was thinking to myself, Blackheads house? Holy crap. What could this mean? Now, I'd heard of blackhead sheep. I'll show you some blackhead sheep. So these are blackhead sheep. This is a picture from the British Archive, and this is on Trinidad. And the British Archives, so for those of you online who are watching and might recognize one of the people in the picture, the British Archive needs your help because they have a whole host of pictures from the Caribbean in which they have taken photographs of people and they don't know who they are. Like how does that work? How can you take a picture of someone in an educational setting, as this is the case, and don't know who the people are that you're depicting? Anyway, sidetrack. These are blackhead Persian sheep on Trinidad. Now, Trinidad is now part of Trinidad and Tobago, and I'll come to that in a second. So, I decided to go to the Blackheads house in Riga, right? Because I'm thinking to myself, okay, so blackheads and these African heads on the silver plate, what could that mean? And then you come across this building, and it's huge. It's pretty amazing looking. And I'm looking at it, and I'm like, wow, this must be really, really old, right? Here you see a picture of it, black and white, before the First World War, before the Second World War, and you're like, okay, wow, amazing. Now, the current version, this one, was actually rebuilt in 1999. In 1945, the Nazis bombed it, the original one. And then when the Soviets came in and occupied Latvia until the beginning of the 1990s, they kept promising that they would rebuild this building, and they actually never did. So what do the Latvians do? The first thing, they get their independence again, because Latvia itself is a country that was established in 1918. After the Second World War, when everything was in disarray, this group of intellectuals, academics, politicians came together and they're like, you know what, this is the moment. This is the moment we need to say that we're an independent country. They called out the Republic of Latvia, 1918. It didn't last that long in that instance because of, you know, the market crash, authoritarianism, dictatorships, and then the Soviet occupation. But when they got it back, one of the first things they did is they rebuilt this museum. So this is actually not that new. It's about 20 years. Now, what's interesting is that when you go to the Blackheads house and you stand outside it, the door you see on the side of the building has this picture of St. Maurice on it. I think in the live stream you can see it as well. So this is a depiction of St. Maurice, which was done in 1999, which I think is interesting. Now, if you go inside the museum, you see various depictions of black people. Here, St. Maurice is on the roof. If you look it up yourself, you'll see it a bit better. I was trying to make sure that I'm not reproducing the violence that much, but sometimes you can't get around it without having to talk about it, but okay. So you can look it up and you can see it. And as I was walking through this place, I kept thinking to myself, what does it mean to recreate these images in 1999? To once again present blackness within this context of servitude. So, the Blackheads House and the Blackheads Brotherhood was established in 1399, and it was a group of an association of unwed merchants. And they would travel around, buy and sell things, and whenever they came back to their clubhouses, so there's one in Tallinn in Estonia, and there's one in Riga, and there are a couple as well in Germany, they would bring back riches, silver, to donate to their organization. But in 1999, this isn't necessarily necessary, right? These depictions of blackness within that context. So what's going on? Now, I walked to the museum, and at a certain point you go to the first floor, the ground floor, and there's a place place where there are a bunch of pictures of dignitaries which came to this museum. So you have presidents, you have people from NATO, you have EU people, and you're like, these are people who, you know, in the context of what this is showing, should know better, right? Well, no. Because you walk through this place, this ground floor level, and what do you see? You see 18th century, 19th century, 17th century depictions of black people half naked or naked, as statues, as candle holders, as clocks, as lamps, as part of decorations. And I'm just standing there and my whole body is tingling, because I'm like, what is this? This is 2019, what am I seeing in this place? And when you look at the information that's in the, because they have a book, and when you're looking at the information in the book, there's nothing being written about these depictions of blackness. It's about how Wagner one time was there and did some stuff, and they have a bunch of busts of like Mozart and Beethoven in there, and there's this, and they talk about a grand hall where music performances are organized, and you're like, but the black people, what's the story? What's the necessity? What do we do? What are you doing showing this still? I tried to have a little bit of a conversation with people at the reception about it, and at a certain point I realized, okay, they might not quite know what I'm trying to get at, so I'm just going to leave it. I don't want to, you know, impose myself. But I started thinking more like, okay, what does this mean? What does it mean when Saint Mauritius, who was their patron saint, who they adopted as their patron saint in 1399, is then connected to these images of servitude, these images of dehumanization. Now, Saint Mauritius himself, born in Meroe in Sudan, contemporary Sudan, then traveled to Alexandria. In Alexandria became part of the Coptic Church, Orthodox Church. And from Alexandria, he then ended up in the Swiss Alps, because in Alexandria he's part of the Theban Legion, a fierce fighting Roman legion. He was a commander in there, but he was also Christian. So when they were sent to kill off this pagan village in the Swiss Alps, this, according to the Romans' pagan village, because they were Christians, Mauritius said, no, I'm not going to do it. Now, then the emperor at the time decided, you know what, we're going to decimate you. And decimate means kill 1 every 10th person. So 1 every 10th person, the soldiers, was killed. They did this 2 or 3 rounds. And then Maurice was like, you know what, this is done. I'm not accepting this anymore. I'll sacrifice myself to save this village and to save the rest of my soldiers. So that's what happened, right? So Maurice sacrificed himself, martyred himself in 283. Now, go ahead, fast forward to 600 years later, 700 years later, in the 600 years later, in the 9th century, he's canonized. He's made into a saint because of what he did. And there's something interesting that happens there, because the story of what he did was retold countless times and changed, so we don't quite know what actually happened. All we know, he was canonized, because he was saving his village. Now, when you think about this, then once again, the notion of blackness within the remembering of Saint Maurice is connected to his sacrifice for white Europeans, right? So within the Blackheads house, he's presented as protecting these white merchants, and within the Catholic understanding of his position in history, he's there to save a white village. So once again, in terms of servitude. And then I started thinking more. Okay, so what does this mean? And initially, when we were going to have the conference in Stedelijk Museum, I was invited by Ola Hassanan, and Ola Hassanan is an architect from Sudan. She's amazing. You should look up her work if you get the chance. And she looks at the ways in which architecture is connected to gendered space and gendered movements through space. Okay? And I wanted to talk about this work, this project. I wanted to talk about St. Maurice. I wanted to talk about the position of St. Maurice and the way how we traveled. Because we don't quite know how we traveled. We don't quite know where he went to. And then, as I was doing that, I started thinking through this notion of Amsterdam and the Hanseatic region. And I started thinking through the history of the Blackheads house, but also the time in which the Blackheads house was operating. Right? So, they're operating before colonialism, they're operating during colonialism, and they're even, in a certain way, operating now. Because these clubhouses still exist, the organization still exists, but not the way how it was done before, but the terms in which they're operating, the logic behind it is still there. And then I understood that before Latvia was Latvia in 1918, for a whole long while, it was actually part of the Polish-Lithuanian Empire, and it was a duchy called, duchy, I keep saying the word wrong, but whoever is, someone can correct me later on. Duchy of Courland and Semigalia. And the Duke, in the 17th century, Duke Jacob Kettler, wanted to participate in the European colonial expansion project. So, I'm like, what? Right? When we talk about European expansion, we talk about France, we talk about the Netherlands, Spain, we talk about Britain, we talk about Portugal, but the Baltic countries as well. Like what? Scandinavia as well? Like what? How does this compute? Like I knew about Sweden, and I knew about the ways in which the iron ore that was mined in Sweden was used for all the shackles of the enslaved. I knew that. I knew about Denmark and the way how Denmark had also gone to the Caribbean and colonized some islands and then lost them because they went bankrupt in 1917 and then sold them to the US. So the US Virgin Islands used to be Danish. If you go to the islands now, you'll find a bunch of street names that are Danish. And one of the reasons I know that as well is because my great-great-granddad was Danish. Which is interesting as well. Because I mean, you just heard from Curacao St. Martin's. How does that work? Now, so I started thinking through, okay, so wait, so Courland, this duchy wanted to be part of this project. How does this work? Now, the Duke Jacob Kettler, before he became a Duke, he was traveling throughout Europe because his father had been exiled. So he traveled with his dad to what we now know as Europe, to what we now know as France, to what we now know as Germany, and then at a certain point ended up in Amsterdam and also in Middelburg. And Middelburg is important because you had the Middelburgse Commercie Company. And the Middelburgse Commercie Company was one of the partners of the VOC, and they were connected with also the WIC, and they were heavily invested in the colonial trade of human beings, spices, and goods. Right? And so he's in Middelburg, and he's in a cafe, I imagine, and he's hearing some soldiers talk about how difficult it is to colonize Tobago. I'm like, what? Tobago? I know Trinidad and Tobago, right? Because I just showed you the Blackheads sheep. So what does this mean in terms of? And look, this is Trinidad. So you have Trinidad. These are boats and ships, British boats and ships. And you have this idea of it always being in the hands of the British. And then you realize, but wait, no. as everything, it actually was also fought over. So then you have this image, which I'll show you now, which I think is really fascinating in terms of thinking through the ideas in which the Caribbean in our minds and in our presentations of it is always in the time now, right? And it's not in the understanding of the time beforehand. So when you think about the Caribbean and you think about the ways in which the Caribbean is presented, we don't hear the stories of the battles which were actually fought on these islands for these islands. So this image is an image of a battle that was fought between France and the Netherlands on Tobago in 1666. And it's part of the Rijksmuseum collection. You can find it there. There's a colored one, and there's also a black and white version. And the black and white version was also printed in newspapers at the time to let people know that the Dutch had lost Tobago. It's like, wow. Like, okay, but what were they doing there, right? It's like, huh? Tobago was one of the biggest sugarcane plantations in the Caribbean. Just like Jamaica ended up being the biggest one, in which a lot of organizations, a lot of banks that we still know, like Lloyd's Bank was connected to the sugar plantation in Jamaica, and also Tate, the Tate Sugar Factory of the Tate Museum was also connected to sugar plantations in Jamaica. On Tobago, the same thing. Now, I love this picture because if you look at, this image here, I'll circle it here. What does that look like to you? Sorry?
Shall we say it?
Say it.
Black person?
Black person, yes. What it also looks like, and I'll show you here, is the crest of the Geelvink family. So whenever these families or whenever these people who have these things in their family crests want to deny it, I'm like, wait. You have specific images that show you what's going on, right? That are telling you this history in plain language. Not beating around the bush, not ignoring it, not attempting to diffuse the situation. These families in their crests are telling you that they were connected to slave trade, and these paintings tell us what that looked like, and that these images, that these family crests are real in that sense. It's not a metaphorical depiction of something else, it's black people that they're showing. Now, and I love this image as well because the way in which it's in the center of the painting in a certain way, but yet at the same time obscured, also talks about marronage, also talks about fugitivity, also talks about the notions in which black people in the Caribbean and elsewhere have attempted to escape these oppressive situations by going into somewhere where they could not be seen, could not be heard, could not be felt, right? And so I started thinking to myself, okay, so wait, so if we go back to St. Maurice, and the way how he's been depicted, and we attempt to do something else with it, what can we do? How can we push this? And here, a lot of the work that I'm doing and connecting to is also because in 2016 I was given the, I was awarded the Steven Engelsman grant from the Tobago Museum, from the Research Center for Material Culture, which is connected to the National Museum of World Cultures, from which the Tobago Museum, the African Museum, and the World Museum of Rotterdam and the Ethnological Museum in Leiden are connected together. A side note as well, one of the only reasons that they're connected together is because in 2011, our Prime Minister and his cabinet defunded those museums. Just as they defunded from the national budget, the NINSE, Nationaal Instituut Nederlands Slavernij en Erfenis, so the National Institute for Dutch History and Research on Slavery, it was defunded 10 years ago. Right? So a lot of the work that's being done by people with this material that we have, which is in plain sight, which is telling us plainly what was done, is done against the grain of institutional violence, as I would call it. Presented as bureaucratic, number crunching and stuff that had to do with the recession, but then, you hear Starbucks got a deal. But we don't have enough money. That's a different conversation. So the Dr. Steven Engelsman grant from the Research Center for Material Culture gave me the opportunity to dive more deeper into these archives and to think through the ways in which the museum and the people who are working at the museum, Amal Al-Haj, Lisa Swaving, and Wayne Modest, who's simply amazing. If you ever get to see one of his, when he speaks, just go. If you ever get to read one of his texts, look it up. He's pushing the conversation in the Netherlands to a different level, and we're all glad for it, and we're all happy. Anyway, so the Research Center for Material Culture is pushing these questions on the ways in which the collection that they have needs to be used in a way to differently remember that past. Not along the dominant modes in which a lot of people feel ashamed, or a lot of people want to refuse that past, or a lot of people want to reject the ways in which that past has been used and is being used to create systems of oppression today. But the ways in which you can look at that and think through against the grain, look for the gaps, look for the silences, think about those silences and what they could mean. And I was thinking through this, and I was okay, so you have these pictures of Trinidad, you have these pictures of Tobago, the Blackheads house, this patron saint, Saint Maurice, and then to come and find out that Saint Maurice is also the patron saint of weavers, of dyers, and cloth making. So he's the patron saint of carpet making, which is like, wow, right? Amazing. When you think about the ways in which Edward Glissant also talks about the tapestries and weaving together of different connections, different stories, not to be dominant, but to be together. And you're like, okay, there's something we can do here. Now, luckily for me, I have awesome friends. And one of those is Mina Ouaouirst. And I met her because in 2010, I went to do a workshop facilitator program at Studio West. And Studio West is like a production house in Amsterdam New West, which is amazing. So also that, check them out. Check out the work that they're doing. The ways in which they're teaching kids about media literacy, the ways in which they're teaching youngsters how to make media, think about media, position themselves in regards to media is some of the best work that you can find. So check it out. And Mina was my tutor of how to deal with kids in a workshop setting. And when you're thinking about kids, I'm thinking about like teenagers, youngsters, a bit unruly, knowing how to play with images but don't quite know what they want to do with it, and that kind of stuff. And it was awesome. It was great. We kept in contact, we became good friends, and then last year she told me that her family in southern Morocco also are carpet weavers. I was like, hey, okay. Maurice, carpet weaving, patron saint of carpet weaving, there's something that can be done there. And so we started thinking through the ways in which we could present this story, or we could think about the ways in which we fill in the gaps in the life of Saint Maurice. Because if you think about Saint Maurice and all you know is where he was born, where he died, then there's something missing in between. He was born in 238, he died in 283. So there's like 50 years there where a lot of things must have happened and a lot of things that were not written down. And Mina has an amazing aunt, Zara alive, and Mina asked her aunt to come up with a story of what could have happened if Maurice did not travel via this side, but via this side. Am I doing it right? No. Okay, what if Saint Maurice traveled via Morocco and Spain and France to get to the Swiss Alps? What type of encounters could he have had? Who could he have met? What type of legacies could he have left behind? And how were those legacies still remembered today? And so her aunt sang a song for us. Song play, because you just have to go to the Stedelijk Museum to hear the whole song. Teasers, right? That's how you do it. And you can also hear me together with it. That was done by my brother, Jürgen Gario. He did the audio work on that. And we started thinking about the ways in which this song could then be interpreted within a tapestry. Because one of the things that struck me as well about these colonial presentations around this presentation of the Blackheads house was the idea of these tapestries which hung around these buildings, inside these buildings. What if this tapestry was not a recollection or representation of white European dominance, but what if it was about remembering through violence, remembering beyond violence, remembering through the gaps and remembering past the gaps, the silences. And so we were connected with the cooperative Kasbe Taznacht. I hope I said it right. And they're an amazing organization based in Taznacht in southern Morocco. And so we had Fatma out Aktif, Mina uit Sidi Hamou, Habiba El Katiri, and Naima Ouaouirst, weaving and designing and working collaborative with us on this story. So it's also this way in thinking through the ways in which it's not about extraction of something from somewhere else to be presented within the Stedelijk Museum, a museum which is literally built on where in the late 19th century there was a colonial exhibition. But thinking through the ways in which the resources which we have here can then be used to repair the damage done somewhere else, right? To not necessarily reverse the trajectory of flows of money, but to think differently in the ways in which we do deal with our resources. And so the work is thinking through the ways in which this story, this presentation of Saint Maurice can also be told transhistorically. So one of the things that we did is we have a film which Mina shot images for, also images that I shot in Curaçao and St. Martin last year, together with archival footage to create a transhistorical way of remembering and trying to repair that damage that was done through violence, through institutional violence, through discursive violence, and through literal material violence. I'm not going to show that. You can also see that in Stedelijk Museum, so go and check it out. But what I am going to show is something else which we also did, and that was slides. So one of the things that we wanted to do is include this visual information of these archives, the British Archive, the Archive of the National Museum for World Culture, these archives which in a sense also reproduce this violence and use that differently or present that differently or try to get around that violence and think through the ways in which we could repair that harm. To have these intertextual, trans-historical, interdisciplinary conversations. And so these are our representations in which you can see sentences that were sung by Zara Aleid, which were translated by Fuzia Tukar, and they were translated in English, but also in Derija. And I think the interesting thing is that Derija is the middle line you can see. And so that's Arabic spoken in Morocco, but then written in Latin script. And then under it you have Stedelijk, but then presented in Arabic script. So when spoken aloud by someone who can read Arabic, they would not hear actual Arabic. So you would hear this language which was displaced, this language which was threatened, this language which was pushed aside and attempted to be discarded. Right? So it's a project to which we're trying to repair and remember. And I think the last thing I want to end with before we go to questions is the ways in which this work is a collaboration, but also a way in which we can think through the ways in which we make kin differently, right? So thinking through the ways in which we're related, in which we are relating to one another, in which we are connecting to one another beyond blood, beyond the idea of specific histories belong to specific people, but thinking through the ways in which those histories can be woven together and brought towards a dismantling of the systems that oppress us all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Quinsy. That was amazing. That was such a revealing journey. It's incredible. Yeah, you mentioned Wayne Wallace, and actually he was our guest 2 years ago, and then he gave us a short introduction into critical validation. And I think that yeah, you just also produced that critical validation to fill in the gaps or to reveal counter histories or to make new connections that are not officially in the books or in the archives. So that was really something. So yeah, please all check it out in Stedelijk Museum, the work. But you can also ask a question or make a comment right now.
I would like to make a suggestion for the people that are watching. There are 85 viewers and they might want to make questions also in the comments. Would you like to answer to those as well?
Definitely, yeah. So for the 85 people who are watching, thank you for being with us, and then send your questions to us, and we'll try to answer.
No, I think that they can ask. They can ask their questions right now. The people in the Thanks.
Also.
Of course, yes.
Also,
Well,
yeah.
definitely,
As
yeah.
well.
Can we try to do this microphone? So also,
Well, there was a question about the architect friend of mine. Her name is Ola Hassanan. Yeah, she was a Buck Fellow, also 2017, 2018. Yeah, and she's just amazing. So yeah.
Any other questions? I think Quincy, I have a question. I was reading that you with BIJEEN, a new political party, are also aiming to become, I guess, part of the Dutch Parliament, a member of the House of Representatives. And I wonder if, and if so, what and how some of your artistic practices and strategies will also then come into play, or that you will take with it.
Well, I think that the thing is that what's happened with politics here in the Netherlands is that the political has been stripped of it. So politics as management of life, management of nature, instead of thinking through what it means to politically engage with life, or politically engage with nature, with our surroundings, politically engage with the past and the ways in which the violence of the past can be dismantled through policies that we have now. And so my contribution hopefully will be to have this more rich conversation about what it is that we want and how we care for one another. I think one of the ways in which we're seeing politics as it's being produced and as it's being as it's being seen as an arena for games is that a lot of the people who are part of it are not affected by their own policies. So you're going to have conversations in which the thousands and thousands of people who are dying in the Mediterranean is not connected to understandings of political policies here. It's constantly thinking through the ways in which we should keep people out instead of understanding that the reason that they're fleeing is because we're the ones who are doing things or engaging in behaviors which is causing violence and causing them to flee. So it's thinking through that long durée of colonial violence and the way in which we have the tools and we have the insight to change them. So I hope that with this work that I'm doing and the way how I'm thinking through it and the people who are part of BIJEEN, that we together are able to push that different narrative. I mean, that's what the party intended to do. It's the first party established by a black woman in the Netherlands, ever, right? It's the first party which is spearheaded by a black woman, which is trying to get into parliament. Right now we have a parliament where there are no black people in there. There are no people of there are people of African descent, people who are of Moroccan descent, but the terms in thinking through people with a colonial link to the Netherlands, and who are visibly colonially linked to the Netherlands, that's missing. And I think a lot of conversations then get to happen in these arenas of power that leave out what this means. I'm from Curaçao and St. Martin, which I said earlier. Supposedly we're no longer colonies, but if you look at the ways in which we're talked about, it's still from this idea that the Netherlands knows best. The Undersecretary a while back even literally said that the islands are immature to have full autonomy. Like, what is that? How can this be accepted behavior, language, rhetoric? How can this be something that we continue with in 2021? Like, no, this needs to stop. And I think the work that I'm doing, and that I'm lucky enough to do, because I mean, the Stedelijk Museum, you all invite me to keep talking. I'm like, yeah, I'll figure out the ways in which I can keep talking in that different arena as well.
Can I ask one more question?
Yes.
Quincy, it's because this Studium is also reflecting on the different forms of embodiment. Yeah, that is also what you do in the work, and different forms of embodiment play a role in that. I was thinking also because of the question you just brought up, say the activist side, of course, but the way protest is also a way of embodiment, you could say, or embody protest, and the way you embody your artistic practice and your activist practices, they overlap, I guess. But do you see, how do you look at that yourself?
Well, and a lot of my friends disagree with me, but I actually refuse the label of activist. I don't see myself as an activist in that sense. I have friends who are making sure that undocumented people are not sleeping on the streets, who are pushing back against deportation fights, who are making sure that abortion rights are still being protected, guiding people and helping women towards abortion clinics. Those are activists, right? That's in a certain material condition, material work, which is pushing back and fighting for, and I'm in awe of what they do. I find it difficult to say that I'm in the same league as them, so I'm like, no, we should make sure that it's not the ones who speak the most who get like the accolades, but it's the ones who do the work who get the accolades. And I think that's the difference in which I see activist or my activist work and my artistic work. I think my artistic work pushes back against institutional violence when I'm in there, and that is then read sometimes as activist, but that's not my intention.
Okay, thank you.
I'll repeat the question if you say it.
Can you maybe talk a bit about the aesthetic choices of the video?
So there's a question about the aesthetic choices. Well, I mean, what Mina and I tried to do, and together with the whole team, was to think through the ways in which some visuals and some images have been kept from each other because of geographical location or because of different archives, because of the ways in which we have become disciplinary in thinking through how we look at things, and we've tried to push back against that. Also with the audio score, it's about interweaving, and it's about trying to figure out like how do they connect and how do they feel right. So the aesthetic choices are less visual, less connected to this idea of a certain clean aesthetic, and more connected to rhythms. What are the rhythms that we're trying to create? What are the rhythms and the beats that we have within the work? So when you go to Stedelijk Museum and experience the work, the slides have a different timing, the video has a different timing, and the audio has a different timing. So whenever you're there, you can see something, experience something completely different than if you were there 2 days before. And it's about thinking through the ways in which these connections and these timings and this linearity of time needs to be discarded, right? Because when we think about the ways in which, I was just talking to a friend of mine, Martyr, Charles, theater maker, and you should go watch his piece, the 13th to the 16th of October in Rode Theater in Rotterdam. Welcome to our guest house, plug. Is the ways in which, when we think about sci-fi and the way how sci-fi, for example, talks about the end of the world, for a lot of people the end of the world already came. Right? The end of the world was 1492. So we're already living in the apocalypse of someone else. So even thinking through these thinkings of time and rhythms and experiences and presences, you push against the norm or the hegemonic aesthetics which you would tend to find within the museum. And we're lucky because we're part of an exhibition which I think is groundbreaking in and of itself. I mean, it's named after Mahmoud Darwish, his last collection. It's pushing against all these institutional rigidities and trying to think of the ways in which we can enter the future and enter tomorrow differently and otherwise, and in conversation with one another. And yeah, it's an honor to be part of it and to work with the people I get to work with.
Quinsy, we have one question from one of the people watching the live stream.
From Carolina Wilton. Hello, Quinsy. I have a question about your opinion on colonial statues and monuments in the Netherlands. How would you suggest to treat them? Install an anti-statue or get rid of them? Replace them?
Well, it's a great question. Also in terms of thinking through the ways in which sometimes these public calls, the ways in which these public calls for statues are sometimes co-opted to then not do anything else. Right? So sometimes it becomes, okay, you remove the statue and then you should be content. That's it, that's all we're going to do, and after that, no more conversations about inequalities, no more conversations about colonial past, no more conversations about how to better care for all of us. So I think, yes, these statues which venerate mass murderers and genocidal maniacs and genocidal, sorry it's ableist language, but these genocidal, murderous colonial figures, they need to go. I mean, they're not what we aspire to. And I think monuments and monumentalizing is always looking towards what do we aspire towards, right? Do we aspire towards Winston Churchill? No, I don't think so. Do we aspire towards J.P. Koon? No, not anymore. At least I don't. I mean, you have some people, I won't name names, but you have some people who want to reinstate and rethink through the colonial project as something that was good. And I don't think that's what public space should be used for. I think public space should be used for public engagement. It needs to be taken away from the commercializing tendency that we have now to put a poster up on everything. So it should not become a place where, you know, you get a next advertisement for, I don't know, some movie or something. Right? Yeah. So these statues and the conversations about the statues need to be connected to a larger project of dismantling, not just in public space, but also in political institutions, also within public institutions, also within care, in education, in all these different things in which we come together, the oppressive mechanisms of the past, which still cause for inequalities today. So yes, and it's not enough.
There's another question.
There's another question.
From Nomin Zizigma. Thank you for your talk and time. Language displaced by translation into a different script as in the project which you just presented and their trans-historical overlaps. It sort of becomes a question to the politics of language itself. This makes me wonder not only the erasure of language as a device of oppression, but even as far as the weaponization of language. What are your thoughts on this?
Language can be violence. Yeah. So the weaponization and the ways in which terms and concepts are used to exacerbate material violence, to inspire material violence is definitely there. And I think the ways in which Mina and I worked on this project was to think through the ways in which this language and the conversations around language that we had were connected to thinking beyond just the straightforward violence, but also thinking through the ways in which translation, or the ways in which wanting a certain concept to adhere to a certain register, a certain cosmology of thinking, because it's translated in a different language, also needs to be looked at and questioned and put against the light, or put against our ear, or put against our heart, to think through what does it mean when Stedelijk is presented in Derija, is presented in English. What does it mean when this language is then heard and be echoed throughout the corridors of the Stedelijk Museum? How does that bring us, or how does it make the institution itself dismantle its colonial conditioning or its coloniality? And I think the violence that we talk about is the violence of erasure of St. Maurice's life, is the violence of Duke Jacob attempting to colonize Tobago, is the violence of France and its occupation of Morocco, is the violence, and continue and continue. And so the violence and the way in which we are attempting to repair that is to think through mechanisms of contact, and think through mechanisms of public gathering and public being together. And also this notion of the weaving. I mean, the weaving carpets itself, there was archaeological digs done in which the methods and methodology used in southern Morocco for carpet weaving could be found, traced back 2,000 years ago, right? Knots, methods of passing threads through material, all these different things. And you're thinking to yourself, okay, so this is an archive. This is a way of thinking through beyond simply the visual, beyond language, beyond the language that is communicating, right? So it's a different type of connection and a different type of archive that we're thinking about, in which it's not about a utilitarian function of it, but in which the archive itself becomes something that you sense differently.
Is there another question from you here in this space? Otherwise, there is another question from one of the people who.
From Moses Bedos. How do you go about uncovering a history long neglected in the historical narrative? How do you still find sources, especially regarding to St. Mauritius?
Well, I mean, sources, I think that's also one of these different questions. And that comes back to critical fabulation as well, is when the official sources aren't there, then you have to be interdisciplinary, and then you have to think about what it means to think about different types of archival sources, right? So here, we have collaborated, we have invited, we have enveloped Mina's aunt, right? So it becomes about thinking through family histories and family connections as rich repositories of information itself as well. A lot of my work is together with my family, in which it's also about thinking through the ways in which sometimes silences within family can be probed in a careful manner, in a manner through which everyone still has their boundaries and can keep their boundaries, but also through ways in which you can talk about things that someone might have thought wasn't important. What the anecdotal is, what the stray observation is, and that becomes a wealth of information that tells you so much more than you could ever find in any archive. And so when thinking through St. Mauritius' life, it was about trying to recover and retrace steps which the wind probably blew away already and erased for us. The ways in which within the landscape, traces, physical traces themselves are sometimes refused by nature. So then it becomes about, okay, so how do you have this thinking through ephemeral archives and thinking through thoughts and feelings and how different types of information can be transferred, not just through material objects, but through memories, through imaginations, through dreams, which sometimes people don't connect, but that you as the artist, as the researcher, as the one with this aesthetic baggage that you're learning in art academies like these, can then transform into something else. I mean, we're kind of like magicians. And so thinking through what resources are, you also have to think like magicians, right? Not like that exhibition, Magicien de la Terre, but in a different way. Thinking through the ways in which our access to certain knowledges and our access to certain tools to transfer our ideas and our feelings and our thinkings and our imaginations can give like different insights into what an archive, what a resource can be. And it's also for us, if I may say so, it's also for us not about extracting knowledge. It's about feeding, and it's about exchanging, and it's about having these connections which aren't about a take, but about a give and receive in a certain sense. I hope that answers Moses' question.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you all.